The Sector 47 9S Archives.
Archive 348, The War of the Worlds. Former classification, restricted. In the official history of Earth, the story begins with a writer. That is convenient, because writers are accustomed to receiving credit for things they did not entirely understand. The actual story began 43 years earlier, with a historian who was supposed to be observing humanity. In 1895, Professor Ikyrian Vox of the University of Pirus, in the Kepler system, was assigned to Sector 47 9S as part of a scientific expedition. His specialty was military history. This was considered an appropriate field for studying humanity. By the 19th century, humans had accumulated a substantial historical record of armed conflicts, and their tendency to repeat them provided our researchers with an unusually large body of comparative material. Professor Vox was particularly interested in the relationship between technological development and warfare. He was therefore permitted to bring several reference volumes from his personal collection. The collection was considerable. Vox had spent more than 2 centuries acquiring historical works from different civilizations throughout the Union. Some described battles involving armies of millions. Others concerned conflicts between species that no longer existed. One volume described a war that had lasted 11 hours. Another documented a conflict that had continued for nearly 4 centuries, largely because nobody involved could agree on how to terminate it. Professor Vox considered this an important subject of study. The Cultural Containment Division considered it a potential logistical problem. Books were not classified as dangerous technology. They were, however, classified as cultural material. Cultural material left on a pre-FTL world could create complications. Not always serious complications. Sometimes the only consequence was that humans developed an incorrect theory about something they had found. On other occasions, they developed a religion. The expedition itself proceeded without difficulty. Vox established his observation site, adopted a suitable human identity, and spent several months moving between academic institutions and historical archives. He was particularly interested in European military history. He attended lectures, examined manuscripts, purchased several human books, and maintained detailed observations of the local population. His reports were excellent. I have personally reviewed several of them. They were precise, objective, and almost completely free of the usual mistakes made by inexperienced field historians. Vox understood the principle of non-interference. He understood the importance of maintaining a plausible identity. He understood that human governments should never be given evidence of extraterrestrial activity. He even understood the requirement concerning personal belongings. Every item taken onto a pre-FTL world was supposed to be inventoried before departure. Every item was supposed to be accounted for afterward. Professor Vox's inventory was almost perfect. Almost. When he returned from Earth, one book was missing. It was a relatively old volume. The book had been produced approximately 12,000 years earlier, during a period when several civilizations that would eventually become members of the Galactic Union were still engaged in open warfare. It was not classified material. It contained no technical information that could accelerate human development. It did not contain star charts, engineering diagrams, or instructions for interstellar travel. It was simply a historical account of an ancient war. That distinction would become important later. According to procedure, Vox was required to report the missing book immediately. He did not. Instead, he completed his final inventory and submitted his report. The relevant section read,
All cultural materials transporting to the observation site have been recovered or properly disposed of.
That statement was not entirely accurate. We do not know whether Vox deliberately omitted the book or genuinely believed that it had been lost somewhere in the field and would never be found. His later testimony suggested the second explanation. His administrative record suggested the first. Both were plausible. There was, however, another possibility. Professor Vox may simply have wanted to avoid the paperwork. This possibility was considered unlikely by the investigators. It was eventually classified as highly probable. The difference was largely semantic. The missing book should have triggered a containment report. It did not. The final mission assessment was therefore marked satisfactory. Professor Vox returned to the University of Pirus, resumed his academic work, and continued his research into the history of warfare. The agency closed the case. For 43 years, nobody thought about the book again. Then in 1897, a bookseller in London acquired an unusual volume from a private collection. The seller did not recognize the writing. Neither did the buyer. The buyer was an English writer named Herbert George Wells.
The illustrations are extraordinary.
Wells could not read the language. He did not know the civilization that had produced the book. He did not know that the events described in it had actually occurred. He certainly did not know that the book had arrived on Earth as the result of a containment failure. What he did understand was the imagery. The illustrations showed machines moving across unfamiliar landscapes. Large structures stood beneath skies occupied by objects that could not be mistaken for human aircraft. Armored figures advanced against fortified settlements. Cities burned. Other cities surrendered. Some of the illustrations showed creatures from different worlds fighting alongside one another. Others showed them fighting each other. The book was not written as fiction. It was a historical record. Wells naturally had no way of knowing that. He did what human writers have always done when presented with incomplete information. He interpreted it. He filled the gaps. And eventually, he wrote a story about an invasion from Mars. From the perspective of the Cultural Containment Division, this was unfortunate. It was not yet an emergency. Humans wrote stories about impossible things every day. Stories about ghosts. Stories about lost civilizations. Stories about beings from other worlds. Stories about machines becoming intelligent and immediately deciding that humanity had made a mistake. None of this was particularly concerning. The problem was that Wells had accidentally based his fiction on a genuine historical document. More precisely, he had based it on a genuine historical document that described a war fought by civilizations that, 12,000 years later, were now members of the Galactic Union. The Union had changed considerably since then. Large-scale wars between member civilizations had become rare. This was not because the species had suddenly become wiser. We had simply become more bureaucratic. There were now hundreds of agencies dedicated to preventing armed conflict. There were arbitration councils, mediation offices, inspection authorities, sanctions committees, diplomatic review boards, emergency negotiation teams, and at least 4 departments whose jurisdiction overlapped sufficiently that they routinely prevented one another from taking action. The system was inefficient. It was also remarkably effective. A civilization could still declare war. It simply had to complete the required documentation first. Most never reached that stage. The ancient war described in Vox's book belonged to a very different union. It had been a period of expansion, territorial disputes, unstable alliances, and technological competition. The kind of history that Professor Vox found fascinating. To Wells, however, it was something else. It was a story. And by 1898, humanity had one of its most enduring stories of extraterrestrial invasion. We did not intervene. There was no reason to. The book had been misunderstood, but the misunderstanding itself posed no immediate threat. The novel contained no usable technology. No human civilization changed its course because of it. The public regarded it as fiction. The matter remained dormant. At least that was our assessment. 40 years later, an American radio producer decided to discover how accurate that assessment had been. His name was Orson Welles. On the evening of October 30, 1938, the Columbia Broadcasting System aired a radio adaptation of Welles' story. The program was presented in the form of a series of news bulletins. Reports of strange objects, reports of destruction, reports of an invasion, reports that sounded increasingly real. At first, the Cultural Containment Division did not notice. This was understandable. The agency had been monitoring thousands of developing civilizations for centuries. One radio drama was not considered a significant event. Then the first field report arrived. It contained only 6 words. Humans appear to believe it. The report was initially rejected. It was returned to the field agent with a request for clarification. The agent sent a second report. It contained 11 words. Humans appear to believe it very strongly. At that point, Archive 348 was reopened. And for the first time in 43 years, someone asked the question that should have been asked in 1895. Where was the book? The first response from the Cultural Containment Division was administrative. This is worth mentioning because our first response to almost every problem is administrative. A preliminary incident report was opened. The broadcast was classified as a Level 2 cultural disturbance. Level 2 indicated that the population had become confused, but that the confusion was not expected to produce permanent changes in social development. A Level 3 incident involved mass political instability. Level 4 involved religious transformation. Level 5 involved technological acceleration. Nobody wanted to discuss Level 5. The field reports from the United States suggested that the situation was somewhere between Level 2 and Level 3. Human civilians were contacting police stations. Some were leaving their homes. Others were attempting to contact relatives. Newspapers were receiving calls from people asking whether the reported events were real. Local authorities were trying to determine what was happening. The agency's regional office therefore assembled an emergency team.
What exactly is the problem?
The officer responsible for the response was Agent Merivin, a senior field operative with considerable experience in pre-FTL civilizations. He had spent 22 years working among humans. He was familiar with their governments, their military organizations, and their tendency to interpret incomplete information as evidence of deliberate concealment.
The humans believe they are being invaded.
By whom?
Martians?
Actual Martians.
No,
Then why are we involved?
because the humans think they are actual Martians.
This distinction occupied the room for several minutes. Eventually, the team agreed that the incident required intervention. The first step was to determine how much the population actually believed. This proved difficult. Human reactions were inconsistent. Some listeners had accepted the broadcast as genuine. Others had immediately recognized it as fiction. Some had believed it for several minutes before discovering the truth. Others had heard only fragments and reconstructed the rest from conversations with their neighbors. This was particularly interesting to our analysts. The broadcast had not created a single false belief. It had created thousands of slightly different false beliefs. That made the situation much easier to contain. If every human had believed exactly the same thing, corrective action would have been necessary. Fortunately, they did not. Some believed the invasion was taking place in New Jersey. Others believed it was occurring across the entire United States. A few believed the government was hiding information. Others believed the government was involved. Some believed the radio station had made a mistake. Others believed the radio station had deliberately caused the panic. There were even people who believed the broadcast was a warning from the military. None of these interpretations were correct. Collectively, however, they were extremely useful. The division's analysts reached a preliminary conclusion. Humanity did not require a convincing explanation. Humanity required uncertainty. This was a principle we had learned through centuries of field operations. A population that receives one convincing explanation tends to organize around it. A population that receives several plausible explanations tends to argue. Argument was preferable. Argument was stable. The response team therefore decided not to suppress the story. They would not announce that the broadcast was harmless. They would not provide evidence that extraterrestrial life did not exist. They would not interfere with the radio station. Instead, they would speak privately with Orson Welles. This was considered the least complicated option. The team was mistaken. Mr. Welles was not difficult to locate. He was young, ambitious, intelligent, and considerably more interested in the effects of his production than the division had anticipated.
You're from the government.
Welles asked this when Agent Merivin introduced himself.
Not exactly.
That sounds like a government answer.
It is an answer from an organization that has no official reason to exist.
Welles studied him for several seconds.
Are you telling me the broadcast caused a problem?
It caused several problems.
I assume you're here to tell me not to do it again.
No,
Then what do you want?
we would like to discuss the difference between fiction and information.
The conversation took place in a private room. There were only 3 people present. Agent Merivin, a second field operative, and Orson Welles. The second operative placed a folder on the table. It contained no classified documents. There was no reason to reveal anything classified. Instead, it contained photographs. The first showed an object that looked remarkably similar to one of the machines described in Welles' novel. The second showed a structure that did not appear in the novel. The third showed something that Welles could not immediately identify.
What are these?
Historical material.
From where?
That is not relevant.
Then why show them to me?
Because you are a writer.
Welles looked again at the photographs.
Are you saying the story is true?
No,
Are you saying it isn't?
I am saying that the distinction may not be as useful as you think.
This was the point at which Agent Merivin deliberately stopped explaining. He did not confirm extraterrestrial life. He did not deny it. He did not tell Welles that the original book had come from another civilization. He did not mention Professor Vox. Most importantly, he did not tell Welles that the agency had been monitoring humanity for decades. Instead, he made a statement that had been approved by the legal department.
You are free to broadcast whatever fiction you wish.
That's reassuring.
It should be.
And if I decide to do another broadcast like this,
That is also your decision.
then why are you here?
Because if you do, we would prefer that you understand the consequences.
What consequences?
People believe what they are told when the information comes from an apparently credible source.
Welles smiled.
That's hardly a secret.
No, but some secrets are more useful when everyone already knows them.
The meeting ended shortly afterward. No threats were made. No orders were issued. No restrictions were imposed on Welles. The agency did not even ask him to issue a correction. We simply allowed him to leave with the photographs still in his possession. He returned them the following morning. We had expected that. The important thing was not what Welles believed. The important thing was what he thought we might know. This is a subtle distinction. Human beings are remarkably capable of filling gaps in information. Given sufficient uncertainty, they will construct explanations without assistance. Sometimes they will construct several. By the following week, the incident had already begun to change shape. Newspapers debated whether the audience had genuinely panicked. Some reports described widespread hysteria. Others suggested that the reaction had been exaggerated. Radio officials issued explanations. Listeners gave conflicting accounts. Some insisted they had believed every word. Others claimed they had known it was fiction from the beginning. A few later remembered being frightened. although they had not actually heard the broadcast. This was not unusual. Human memory is highly adaptable. We have studied this phenomenon extensively. It is particularly useful during containment operations. Within days, the invasion had become an argument rather than an event. That was exactly what we wanted. The division issued no public statement. Instead, 3 separate unofficial explanations began circulating. One suggested that the broadcast had been misunderstood. Another suggested that the newspapers had exaggerated the panic. A third suggested that certain authorities had known more than they admitted. None of these explanations originated entirely within the agency. That was important. A manufactured explanation can be traced. A naturally occurring explanation can survive for generations. We merely encouraged the natural process. By the end of the year, the incident had become history. The public had returned to its ordinary concerns. The Martians had gone back to being fictional. Or so we believed. There was only one unresolved matter. The book. Professor Vox's missing book had still not been recovered. We had searched the original observation site. We had reviewed every inventory record. We had examined the private collections of several human scholars. Nothing. The official recommendation was to close the investigation. The book was considered culturally contaminated, but no longer operationally significant. The recommendation was approved. The file was closed for the second time. This time we were almost correct. The book was still somewhere on Earth. And the people who eventually found it would not be historians. They would be much less interested in history. They would be interested in proving that the Martians were real. For several years, the Cultural Containment Division considered the incident resolved. This was, in retrospect, optimistic. The problem with human legends is that they rarely remain where you leave them. The broadcast of 1938 gradually became part of popular culture. The panic itself became almost as famous as the story that had caused it. Newspapers revisited the event. Radio producers discussed it. Writers embellished it. Researchers attempted to determine how many people had actually believed the broadcast. The numbers varied considerably. This was useful. By the middle of the 20th century, nobody could agree on what had really happened that night. Some accounts described widespread panic. Others suggested that the reaction had been relatively limited. Some people remembered hearing the broadcast. Others remembered hearing about it from someone else. A few remembered details that had never been broadcast at all. The agency considered this an excellent outcome. We had not erased the event. We had not altered the historical record. We had simply allowed human memory to perform its usual work. There was, however, another matter. In 1952, a retired librarian in southern England contacted a university historian about an unusual book found in the private collection of a deceased scholar. The historian could not identify the language. He could not identify the author. He could not identify the illustrations. He did, however, recognize one of the images. It resembled a machine from H.G. Wells' novel. The information was reported to a newspaper. The newspaper contacted the university. The university contacted the police. The police contacted the government. The government did not contact us. We learned about it from a newspaper clipping. This was considered embarrassing. The matter was assigned to Agent Merivin.
You have got to be kidding.
Those were his first words when he saw the photograph. The photograph showed the book. Not a copy. Not an imitation. The original volume was sitting on a table in an English university archive. The binding was damaged. Several pages were missing. The illustrations were still remarkably well preserved. Merivin immediately requested authorization to recover it. Authorization was denied. The reason was simple. The Cultural Containment Division no longer had jurisdiction over historical objects that had already entered the permanent cultural record. That responsibility belonged to the Historical Contamination Office. Unfortunately, the Historical Contamination Office believed that the matter belonged to the Cultural Containment Division. The disagreement lasted 11 days. During that time, the university librarian placed the book in a display case. Several scholars examined it. One suggested that it might be a medieval European manuscript. Another suggested that it came from an unknown civilization. A third suggested that it was a 19th century forgery. This last theory was particularly inconvenient. It was also useful. The agency encouraged it. A specialist was quietly introduced to the investigation. He examined the book and produced a plausible explanation involving an obscure European dialect, an eccentric collector, and an undocumented translation tradition. The explanation was accepted by some researchers. Other researchers rejected it completely. Both groups published papers. The controversy became academic. Academic controversy is one of the safest forms of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Agent Meravin finally received authorization to recover the book. He arrived at the university after midnight. The building was empty. The book was still inside the display case. Meravin opened the case, removed the volume, and examined it for damage. The first pages contained historical diagrams. The middle section described the military campaign that had inspired Welles. The final pages contained something else. They were not part of the original historical account. Someone had written notes in English. The handwriting belonged to H.G. Wells. We never determined exactly when he had written them. The notes were brief. Most were observations about the illustrations. One contained a question.
What if this was not fiction?
We considered this for approximately 6 seconds. Then we decided it was not evidence of anything. Writers ask questions. That is their profession. The book was recovered and returned to Union custody. The university received a replacement volume. The replacement volume was considerably more valuable than the original. The librarian was satisfied. The university was satisfied. The Historical Contamination Office was satisfied. The Cultural Containment Division was satisfied. Professor Vox was not consulted. He had been dead for almost 2 centuries. His administrative record, however, remained. The original mission report was retrieved from the archives. The inventory was checked again. The missing book was still marked as recovered. We corrected the record. The corrected version required 3 signatures, 2 departmental reviews, and a formal statement explaining why the original report had been accepted. The statement was eventually approved. Its conclusion was remarkably concise. Administrative oversight. That phrase appears frequently in our records. It is one of the most versatile expressions in the Union. It can describe a missing book, a misplaced spacecraft, an unauthorized experiment, or occasionally the beginning of a war. In this case, however, it was accurate. The book should never have reached Earth. Wells should never have found it. The broadcast should never have required our intervention. And yet, none of these events caused lasting harm. Humanity continued to develop. It continued to investigate the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It continued to produce stories about visitors from other worlds. Some of those stories were surprisingly accurate. Most were not. We learned to accept this. The purpose of containment is not to make a civilization believe the truth. That would be impossible. The purpose is to ensure that no single explanation becomes sufficiently convincing to change its development. In that respect, the War of the Worlds incident was almost ideal. There had been a genuine alien artifact. There had been a genuine historical account of an ancient extraterrestrial war. There had been a human writer who unknowingly transformed that account into fiction. There had been a radio broadcast. There had been fear, there had been government confusion, and there had been an agency quietly standing in the background, making certain that nobody could assemble all the pieces. The humans eventually reached their own conclusions. Some believed the broadcast had caused mass panic. Some believed the panic had been exaggerated. Some believed the government had hidden something. Others believed the entire episode proved nothing at all. All of them were correct in one respect. They did not have the complete story. We considered that sufficient. The original book remains in the archives of the Cultural Containment Division. It is stored under a different classification now. Not because it is dangerous, because it is embarrassing. The final page of the recovery report contains a handwritten note from Agent Maravin.
For future reference, do not allow historians to travel with their personal libraries.
Someone added a response underneath.
Agreed.
The response was later removed. Apparently, agreed was not considered an adequate administrative disposition. A new committee was formed. The committee produced a 12-page recommendation. The recommendation was approved 31 years later. By then, the policy had already been implemented. Humanity still remembers the War of the Worlds. It remembers Martians descending upon Earth. It remembers the voices on the radio. It remembers the fear. It remembers the possibility that, for one night, an invasion from another world might actually have been happening. That memory is not entirely wrong. There was an invasion in the original book. There were extraterrestrial machines. There were cities under attack. There were civilizations fighting for survival. It simply happened 12,000 years earlier, on a world several thousand light years from Earth. The humans had only borrowed the story. And as it turned out, they improved it considerably. Ikyrian Vox would probably have objected to that statement. Historians generally dislike alterations to historical records, especially when the alterations make the story more interesting. He would also have objected to the suggestion that his missing book caused the entire incident. He was a serious scholar. He would have argued that no historian could possibly be held responsible for what a writer did with an unintelligible book. He might even have been right. Unfortunately, he failed to report the book. That is the part of the story we can document with complete certainty. After 70 years in the field, I have learned that this is usually the most dangerous sentence in any report. The rest remains uncertain. And in Sector 47-9S, uncertainty has always been considered a successful outcome. Archive 348 closed.